Hello and welcome. I'm Maria Ressa. This is Rappler Talk. And tonight, I'm really excited to help bring to our Philippine audience, our community, someone who's really taking a great role globally for to try to figure out how to keep us safe on the technology that we're using. He's a UK member of parliament. He chaired the UK committee that came out with one of the most comprehensive reports on online harms that our social media platforms, our technology is doing to us users. He's also, as chair of that committee, he pulled together members of parliaments from up to 14 different nations to come together on what is now called the Grand Committee on Disinformation. It just finished its meeting on December 2, but in 2 years ago, that was when I first met Damian Collins. And we sit together on what we call the real Facebook Oversight Board. Damian, it is so good to see you. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Well, Maria, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be with you. And there's one other job I have, which you didn't mention, is I've recently become chair of the all-party parliamentary group for media freedom in the House of Commons, which works closely with Reporters Without Borders, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And we support all the fantastic work that you're doing. So important what you and Rappler do.
No, it's really good to have you there, and to be so vocal about it. So first, let's go back to when you started looking at all of this in 2017. Looking at this, what went through your mind? What were the lessons you learned?
When we started looking at disinformation, it was at a time when we were just becoming aware of the idea of Russian interference in the 2016 American presidential election. The Senate Intelligence Committee in Washington had started to publish some evidence and information about that. There'd also been some analysis done of disinformation on Facebook during that election campaign as well. I remember BuzzFeed in particular producing a report looking at how big the audiences were getting for disinformation. And in the UK, Channel 4 News also did an investigation on disinformation, where they showed how difficult it was for people to be able to separate disinformation from real news. So we thought we would look at that as an investigation, and the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee looks at a whole range of issues to do with media regulation and broadcasting and freedom of the press, all sorts of issues. So we'd looked at issues before, not disinformation, but issues to do with social media companies and platforms and media organizations. So we thought we'd look at fake news because this seemed to be quite timely, because if there's disinformation out there and people can't recognize it, and it's starting to crowd out real news, then that's a problem. And because, as you well know, there's a lot more to being a democracy than holding elections. Citizens making informed choices based on information and facts is really important. I think the journey we went on during that investigation was, at the start, I think we really thought about fake news as being a content problem on social media. Now, people were generating this bad content, and the social media companies perhaps needed to do more actively remove it. And with regards to the Russian ads, to stop people that shouldn't be advertising on Facebook from doing so. So if you're advertising in a foreign country to target voters in America or the UK, then that's against the law. I think what we recognized as we got deeper into this investigation, that this wasn't just about content. It was also about the problem of disinformation is not that just people are generating it and posting it on social media. There is a design issue within companies like Facebook as well, which is that they are designed through analyzing users' data to promote content to them, to engage their attention for as long as possible. And the system, the algorithms that drive that process, don't seem to be that discriminating about the sort of content they direct people towards. And that is a design issue within social media that needs to be addressed, and is something that the companies definitely do have responsibility for. They may not be able to stop people posting bad stuff on their platform, but they can remove it when they see it, and they can use their algorithm to help them spot it, and they can stop their algorithm from promoting it.
So it's interesting also to see the evolution of the Grand Committee, for example, because I think when I testified for you in 2018, the name of the committee was the International Grand Committee on Big Data privacy, and democracy. And then it shifted to fake news, which then you shifted to disinformation, right? Could you take us to each of these changes, right? Because you already told us that the please go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So the sort of when quite early on in my committee's investigation in the select committee investigation into disinformation, we started to work with other parliaments around the world that were investigating the same issues. So we did. I decided that we would hold the hearings with the tech companies, with Google, Facebook, and Twitter, in Washington. I thought it'd be easier to get representatives from the companies to a location in America than making them come to the UK. We wanted to talk to senior people with policy expertise in those companies rather than just their UK representatives. And that was a hearing we held at George Washington University. We questioned Facebook specifically on Cambridge Analytica, and the first time they'd been asked about it in a hearing. And this was about a month or so before the big Cambridge Analytica story sort of hit the international news. What we then noticed was that there was a special committee set up in Singapore to inquire about creating a disinformation law in Singapore. We watched with great amusement Minister Shanmugam in Singapore questioning the exact same person from Facebook that we'd questioned in Washington, and using and this hearing was held just after the Cambridge Analytica story broken. So they used the answers they'd given to us in Washington. I said, well, you said this to the British committee that you didn't know about Cambridge Analytica having Facebook data, but it turned out that wasn't true because you did, and we now know this is what we now know. And I thought this was quite interesting. People taking evidence from one committee hearing and using it in another. And Facebook didn't like it at all. At one point, they said they didn't see why they should have to answer those questions because they were about evidence they'd given to a different parliament. We also then started to develop quite a close working relationship with our equivalent committee in Canada, because at the heart of one of the components of the Cambridge Analytica story was a Canadian data company called Aggregate IQ. And we were questioning them. The UK Information Commissioner was investigating them, and the Canadian committee was investigating them too. So I sort of discussed this with Bob Zimmer, who chaired that Canadian committee, to say, perhaps it'd be great to have a good working relationship. Share evidence that we're finding. We could benefit from each other's work, and that was the start of a good relationship with them. We then sort of got to the phase when Mark Zuckerberg agreed to give evidence to the United States Congress. And he then held a sort of on the record but private meeting in the European Parliament with representatives there. We'd tried to get him to come to the UK to give evidence to us, and he refused to do it. And he sent other quite senior people from the company, but he wouldn't come himself. So I said I happened to be in Washington with Bob Zimmer, speaking at an event for the Atlantic Council, and Nate Erskine-Smith, also on the Canadian committee as well. And I said, why don't we, if Mark Zuckerberg says he can't come to every committee in the world, then why don't we get together in one place and invite him to come give evidence to us collectively? So we agreed to do that. And the first session was held in London, really as a kind of extension of the committee inquiry that I was running, which is on disinformation. And we gathered together a group of 26 different parliamentarians from 9 different countries. And we met together in London for this first hearing, invited Zuckerberg to come, and he declined. It was then agreed that we'd hold a follow-up meeting, which was in Ottawa, which the Canadians chaired under their committee. So the name changed because they did it as part of their investigation, which was on big data and other things as well. And then it really sort of gathered some momentum, and we felt that this was an incredibly useful forum. It was something that parliamentarians anywhere in the world could plug into, and we would get approached by people in different countries who were investigating Russian disinformation or the work of Cambridge Analytica, or were just asking questions about Facebook. And we could say to them, look, rather than having to start from scratch, you can work with us, you can benefit from what we've discovered already, and you can be part of our future hearings. And so that's how the International Grand Committee has evolved. It's not sort of international for the sake of it. It's a coalition of people who are actively investigating these things within their own parliaments. The thing we have in common is we're parliamentarians with a common interest in these issues. There's now an IGC website where you can look at the transcripts and video of all of the previous sessions. And I mean, as you know, Marie, it's not just enabled us as parliamentarians to come together. We've been able to invite witnesses like yourself and Shoshana Zuboff and Roger McNamee, people who are experts in different locations around the world, to talk about issues with tech and also the the impact disinformation has on society.
And out of all of this, what you've done for the UK and then the international efforts that you've helped pull together, what kind of picture do you get? I mean, you mince no words in the UK reports. What picture do you get of Facebook and of the big tech?
Well, we called the big tech companies digital gangsters in the final report, and the reason for that was there's a certain menace to them in a way. If you question them or challenge them, their initial response is one of disregard and then dismissal. But there's a slight cavalierness to what they do, and a sense that they operate outside of the law almost. I mean, they would say they operate strictly within the law, but sadly the law has given them liabilities from being charged or prosecuted for failing to stop disinformation spreading or other harmful content. And so, we felt clearly that the big tech companies need to come under the umbrella of some form of regulation. It can't just be down to Mark Zuckerberg to determine whether disinformation is harmful enough that it should be challenged and removed. And at the moment, we're in a position where in most parts of the world, these decisions are largely being made by the big tech companies. They are under more scrutiny in the UK and Europe, and there's no doubt about that. And that I think suggests real challenges for other parts of the world as well, where they don't have enough content moderators with the language skills necessary to spot harmful and violent content. We particularly called out the way Facebook was used in Myanmar to organise atrocities against the people in the Rohingya community in Myanmar, and Facebook is letting this happen. I think partly because it's not spotting it, but it knows about these things now, and it's not doing enough to mediate and intervene. And so these are real challenges for the world. And one of the things we've discussed with the International Grand Committee is that whilst we have an interest in legislating in our individual countries, I think we should try and set some global standards for these companies to adhere to, just as we have in financial services. In America has its Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Yeah. We have the Bribery Act in the UK. So a UK citizen or a UK company can't behave in a country somewhere else in the world in a way that couldn't do at home. And I think we should think about what those sort of rules should look like for tech as well.
Correct. Your final report also talked about doublespeak, that Facebook will say it welcomes legislation, but lobbies against it, right?
Yeah.
It's some of the most damning words. I guess your interim report was fascinating to me because it was one of the first ones to look at the impact of both Cambridge Analytica and these policies on countries outside the West, like in the global South, where we are most vulnerable. I mean, could you summarize what that is and what needs to happen?
Yes, I mean, I think so. Your country is a good example of what happened when you have a society for which Facebook has not just become a popular tool, but almost becomes the internet, and that it's very easy to game and manipulate and shape what people's experience of news and information is through that platform. It can be used to flood out real journalism and proper news, and leave people in a position where they don't really know what to believe anymore. And this, I think, is one of the big lessons from disinformation, that it's often not there to persuade you of an alternative set of facts, but to leave you in a position where you don't know what to believe. So rather like in George Orwell's Animal Farm, all you need to know is that the leader is always right, and you don't need to worry about anything else. And that's how totalitarian states have developed. And I think there's a real danger that disinformation is used on social media in other parts of the world to do that, to try and isolate and direct, not just protest, but aggression towards enemies of the state and people that speak out with different voices. We've been very concerned to see how here in India in particular, how social media has been used to organize sort of flash mobs of hate and protest against minorities and people there. So it really, if you control this, if you can influence what this pipe of information tells people, and you can crowd out other sources of legitimate news, and then that leads to real problems in society. It can be incredibly divisive. And what we've tried to do sometimes is to say, other countries around the world are not so different from us. But what they've been exposed to the full extent of what this technology can do to a greater extent than we have. And so we should not only take an interest in what's going on in these countries, but we should understand that the same thing will happen here too, unless we do something about it.
And this is why we like your work, Damian. I mean, so I guess the next steps are, you just finished a hearing December 1 and 2 for the committee on the Grand Committee on Disinformation. You talked about the Online Harms Act in your opening speech. I guess what's next? What will be the next step?
So in the UK, the next step I think is the next important step is the UK government publishing an online harms bill. Now, the way that this is, I think, well, we make quite big recommendations in our select committee report calling for this. And what the online harms bill will do is establish a legal duty of care responsibility for tech companies towards their users, and define what that means. And really, at the center of that is the idea that they have a responsibility to protect people from harmful content that can cause harm to them. Some of that content is already illegal. So images of child abuse, for example, is already illegal, and the company could face even criminal liability if it didn't remove criminal content. Content that celebrates terror or encourages people to join terrorist organizations like ISIS, would be an example of that. But also part of it is the idea that there is some content which is not necessarily illegal, but is harmful. I would say like medical disinformation is an example of that. Child bullying could be an example of that as well. And we want the companies to take responsibility there too. And for me, this is not about censoring speech as such, although I think we all recognize that there's always been a line between people's right to speak freely and the harm that speech can cause other people. That's always something that we've recognized in law. But to say we're not so much seeking to regulate speech through the internet. What we are looking to do is place responsibilities on tech companies to prohibit the amplification of that speech. Someone may have very extreme views, but if those views are not being heard by very many people, then the amount of harm that they can cause is relatively small. But if that individual can harness the technology that social media provides to effectively broadcast those opinions and target those opinions at millions of people, then that can cause a great deal of harm. And that's where I think this level of responsibility should come. That's where the company should have a duty of care. So the UK is proposing this legislation and these legal responsibilities, and to give a regulator the power to have oversight over the tech companies about how effective they are at dealing with this harmful content. And this is really important as well, because on the whole, we are largely reliant on self-declared information from the tech companies. So Facebook say they remove 95% of harmful content before anyone reports it to them, but no one knows whether that's true or not. There's never been audited, and they've consistently resisted the idea of academics or independent organizations having the right to come in and audit them, inspect them. So I think we need to give a government regulator that power, and that's what I expect to be in the online harms bill as well.
Fantastic. Last question is, we sit together on the Real Facebook Oversight Board. It is great to listen to what you have to say all the time, whatever we're together. But, we called it an emergency intervention a little over a month before the US elections. Did you feel it was effective? Was it successful?
Yes, I think it had an effect. I suppose I'd say that. So I think that the big companies, particularly Facebook, are both dismissive of criticism on some levels, and believe that they operate almost above any government in the world. But they're also at times quite thin-skinned as well. So, and I think what we saw in the run-up to the election, and I think the Real Facebook Oversight Board played a role in this, was the kind of naming and shaming of things that were happening on Facebook that they'd done nothing about. And I think the intervention they made in saying they would get rid of groups related to the conspiracy network QAnon. Now, how effective they were at doing it is another matter. But the fact they made that step, I don't think that's something they would have done unless they'd come under that sort of scrutiny and pressure. And I think it has led them to think and act differently this year. The question is, I think how do we build on that? And also, how do we make sure that, as I said before, that whilst we want Mark Zuckerberg to do the right thing, if he doesn't do the right thing, it doesn't mean nothing should happen. And I think we're also seeing that the American companies dealing with these problems in different ways as well. I mean, Steve Bannon is a good example. Twitter have closed down his account. Facebook still let him effectively broadcast through Facebook. So, spreading messages, including, calling for the beheading of public figures in America, like Dr. Fauci. So there need to be some rules of the road for this. But I definitely think the the real Facebook Oversight Board helped shine a light on some of these issues, and Facebook did then respond to them. But we can't have a system where it's consistently Facebook only respond to stuff that's brought to their attention. We need them to be proactive and making these decisions for them, rather than being asked to do it.
Right, right. Sorry, I said last, but I'll throw one more, which is Shoshana Zuboff's work has been seminal, and thank you. The Grand Committee introduced me to her work. The business model, and you said this as well in your opening statement, December 1 or December 2. So the business model, if the problem is the business model, how do we deal with this?
Well, so I remember someone saying to me right at the start of our investigation that, whatever you ask them to do something about, dealing with harmful content, remember that the technology they need to do that, they already have, and they use it for running ads. So it's not that they can't do it, it's that they don't wish to do it. So the business model can be both the savior and the example of bad practice as well. So the business model of the attention economy is directing content at people regardless of how harmful that content is. And therefore that's something I think you can change. You could use that same technology to do good. I remember we asked Instagram about this once, to say, you could take the data profiles of teenagers that have self-harmed. You could look at the sort of journey they went on, the sort of content they engaged with. You could spot other people who were engaged on a very similar journey and intervene positively to try and divert them off that path. And you could use data to do that thing. So it's not just about saying you can use the data, you should stop using data that promotes harm. You can start to use data to do good as well. So there's that within the business model, I think, can provide the answer. The other thing though about the business model, and this is something that I think Shoshana's work has been absolutely fantastic in setting this case out so compellingly. But there are other aspects of the business model as well, which are that I think companies like Facebook are actually, I think, increasingly involved in abuse of market power, dominating the market, making it difficult for other companies to compete with them, either by buying them up or closing them down. And in our final report on disinformation, we touch on some of these issues as well, looking at the way in which they had they'd granted access to Facebook data or declined access to Facebook data to companies, dependent on the commercial relationship they had with them or whether they saw them as a threat or not as well. And I think it's good now that regulators around the world are taking much more of an interest in these issues as well.
No, and it will help, I think, determine whether or not our democracy survives in this process, right? Whether journalism and democracy.
Absolutely, because I think it's someone might say, quite not unreasonably, well, if Facebook is as bad as you say it is, why don't people go somewhere else? But they can't. Right. That's the whole. When you look at the history in America, particularly of understanding abuse of market power, it means that you're in a position where you can do things that are to the detriment of your customers, but you don't lose those customers because they've got nowhere else they can go. And when you look at the way in which over 100 years ago the Americans started breaking up big monopoly companies, it wasn't because they were necessarily doing anything bad, but they recognized that market power could be used for detrimental things in the future, and therefore they shouldn't allow their society to get into that position.
No, fantastic. Thank you so much. I mean, more power in 2021, and I look forward to reading more of your great reports, guys. Damian Collins, UK Member of Parliament, Time Magazine called him the politician that put Britain at the forefront of the war against Facebook. Thank you for your work. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me.